As promised, today we're going to be looking at Peter Singer's famous paper from 1972, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. To set up this episode, I've been going through a number of videos of Peter Singer, and in particular on his paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And each of these videos have challenged me to come up with my own views. That's one challenge. A separate challenge is a response to the videos themselves, and I'll take it a step further to the degree that Peter Singer in his own papers challenges us to change our lives if we accept the premises and the conclusions of his logic from the paper. I will extend the challenge to change your own lives in accordance to the counter-argument I'm about to make, if indeed it does convince you to live in a new and interesting way. To start, I've pulled clips from 3 separate videos. I'll put the link in the description, and I'll notate them here as we go through them. Let's first start with Alex Connor and describing briefly who is Peter Singer.
Who has held professorships at both the University of Princeton and Melbourne and specializes in practical ethics and is well known for his books, including Practical Ethics, The Expanding Circle, The Life You Can Save, and also, probably most famously, Animal Liberation, written in 1975, which is thought by many to have kick-started the modern vegan movement and animal rights movement. So thanks for joining us today.
From there, let's go into the paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And we'll rely on 2 other videos, which I've linked here, to kind of set that paper up and explain. There's a allegory in there that we'll be using. Then I'll make a couple of responses at the end of that.
Today we're talking about an absolutely revolutionary paper published by a philosopher named Peter Singer in 1972. The name of the paper is Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And the basic idea is that the moral stance that you have, your attitude towards your moral obligations, and the things that you may or may not do in your life, and the attitude that all of your friends and all of your relatives have, the general moral outlook that everyone around you has, is deeply and profoundly wrong. And the crazy thing about this paper is that, on the surface at least, it's very persuasive. Singer seems to be right. It seems to be, once you go through the argument that he lays out, it seems to be that we need to completely rework our entire society. And more specifically, forget about society for a minute, you need to completely rework your life if your life is going to be a moral one. And sort of what makes the paper so radical is that I can say all of these things, that the thesis of the paper is that you need to completely rework your life without knowing anything about you. I know virtually nothing about your life and your moral outlook and your values and the kinds of things that you do on a day-to-day basis. I can basically make some assumptions about my audience, general assumptions. You live in a broadly capitalistic society, let's assume. There are government regulations and that sort of thing. And you live sometime in the beginning-ish of the 21st century. That's basically enough. If that's true of you, then Singer thinks that your whole life needs to be reworked if you're going to live in a morally acceptable way. Okay.
This is the most controversial paper in modern ethics, and I hope that you'll explore it with me. We will learn why almost everyone watching this video is evil, myself included, how our moral intuitions lead us to ignore atrocities, and how we can all have a greater impact on the world than we might think. 1. Famine, affluence and morality. There is a small child playing quite merrily in the pond, and this brings a smile to your face. After a moment, you notice that the child has fallen over, and as they cannot swim, they will surely drown. You look around and you can't see the child's parents. However, you are wearing your brand new suit that you paid quite a bit of money for, and if you wade into the pond to save the young life, you will ruin this nice possession. What do you do? Meaning that if you don't do something, they will die.
So the first thing I'll call out is in this allegory of the pond and the small child who is drowning, I will note that even though Peter Singer will in future writing reject the naturalistic fallacy, which is to say what is ought to be, the allegory itself is committing that same sort of concern, right? It says we would all save the child from drowning, and therefore we ought to save the child from drowning. What's he going to do with that? He wants to extend that ought to many other areas of our life.
According to Singer, questions of human nature simply do not matter for moral arguments. He points out that any attempt to infer from what is the case to what should be the case is an example of the naturalistic fallacy. He even concedes that the amount of moral altruism he thinks we are morally required to display is unlikely to be achieved on a wide scale.
I'll also note at this junction that this is a very common format for arguing for moral, what he'll call moral significance. And it's set up, the pond is basically a moral dilemma, right? There's a whole category of philosophical questions and puzzles, and we call them moral dilemmas. These often take the form of the trolley, or you're in a plane that's about to crash. There's only so many parachutes, and there's even more people. How do you decide who gets a parachute? There's also the Titanic lifeboat. There's so many lifeboats. You have all these people. How do you decide who gets a lifeboat and who does not? But this whole category of questions I'll label as moral dilemmas. And in this and one of the fun things you can do with a moral dilemma is ask yourself how much of the argument has to do with the form of the argument, and how much of it has to do with the underlying position. And so he's going to contrast your suit with the life of a young child. Now, one note that we'll make at this juncture is in moral dilemmas, right? One of the heavyweight champions that rule all are the child of great potential. And you could almost stack, just take a trolley problem, right? You take the child, you put him on one end of the tracks, and on the other end of the tracks, and I can't imagine a more pathetic competitor, right, is your luggage with your suit in it, right? And so we just re-asked the trolley question. Okay, you have the chance, this train is going to destroy the life of a child, but if you pull the lever, you can divert the train from the life of the child onto the track that has your luggage, and I'm sorry, but you're going to lose your luggage. Okay, what do you do, right? And the child not only wins in the pond example, the child will win obviously in this trolley example. It wins in parachutes. There's only 3 parachutes. You take one, and who do you give the other 2 to? A really old man that's about to die, your luggage, or a young child, and of course we always give it to the young child. The other contenders against the young child that can win, if you've played a number of these, is, for example, a pregnant woman who's completely healthy that we know is going to deliver a healthy baby. Why? It's a twofer, right? Not only do you get the life of the child, but you also get the life of the mother, and 2 is greater than 1. So in that case, if you do the trolley problem with a child and a healthy pregnant soon-to-be mother, maybe the mother wins, right? The other contenders are the scientist who is yet to cure cancer, Einstein at the age of 14, who hasn't made all of his discoveries yet, but now you just have an ordinary kid, and you put them up against Einstein, and maybe in that moral dilemma, Einstein wins. But just going back to the other contender in Peter's paper, I don't know if there are many moral dilemmas that involve a suit, right? it's basically a commodity. Like, okay, you're going to have to take another trip down to the store against a child that you have to go through 9 more months of labor and everything that you have to do to create a child. What is also interesting, though, that I think of this setup is I think the paper is asking us to suggest that moral significance be defined as anything we might give up in lieu of saving the child. And one thing I'll note there is of course, we're living immoral lives by that definition, because there's nothing that we would not give up to save a young child. Like there's actually nothing, right? If I tell you I was about to go home and get some sleep because I've been working 20 hours and I really need that sleep, you would say, but it's a child, like drowning, and you can go in the shallow pond and save them. Like, okay, sleeping is no longer of moral significance. Work is not, going to church would not be. Even things that I was on my way to the university to give my dissertation, to finish my PhD, and I came across this child. I think it would be easier for proponents of this paper to simply say, why would anybody give you a philosophy degree if you drove past this child in preference of your PhD, right? You could almost burn down an entire library or close down an entire university before you would say, no, that's actually more important than the life of a child. So the fact that this paper, goes through first the setup of the moral dilemma with the child versus, basically your luggage and your suit that's in it, and oh my gosh, look at that, the child won. And then, you can go through all of the activities of your day. You can go through almost all of the activities of your life. You would almost have to be, again, the pregnant, soon-to-be mother. You're on your way to the hospital, and if you get out of the car to save the child, you're going to both lose your own life and the life of the baby. All right, fine. Drive past the kid and get to the hospital. Or again, you're this scientist about to save hundreds of thousands of lives through your solution to the cancer problem, and you're dying of cancer and you only have 12 hours to live, or you're dying of some poison and you only have 3 hours to live, and you don't have time to stop. You have to get to a computer to write down your solution so that humanity moves on. But okay, sure, if you set up the problem against the heavy weight of the moral dilemma, then yes, of course, you're going to end up in this sort of conclusion.
Okay, got the example, right? There's a shallow pond or a fountain. When I teach this class on campus, every college campus, including the one where I work in North Carolina, every college campus has like a fountain somewhere, right? There's a fountain there. A small child is drowning in the fountain and will die. You are walking by. You can easily step in and save the child. The cost to you will be just a few moments, and, well, your clothes are going to get wet or muddy, right? Muddy if it's a pond, or wet if it's a fountain, or whatever. This sacrifice, by the way, is not of moral significance, right? It is insignificant that your clothes are going to get a little wet. Oh, and you're on your way to something where you didn't want your clothes to be wet. Okay, that's not a very significant sacrifice. But the death of the child, the drowning death of the child, in almost all circumstances, would be a very bad thing. Well, the thought is, go from this example, if you agree with what Singer says about this example, and I suggest, of course, that you do. If someone just showed up at a meeting and said, hey, there's this kid drowning, but I didn't want to have wet clothes for this gathering, so I just let the kid drown and die, you would be horrified. You would think that this person was evil, that they had done an evil thing. You would not let your friends or family associate with this kind of person.
The other note I'll make here is there is a fair amount of social pressure that's being applied. So, in Plato we have the ring of Gaius, and basically if you put on this ring, nobody knows what you're doing, nobody knows what happened, and you can always ask a trolley or a moral dilemma problem in this sense. So let's imagine nobody would ever know it was you that was pulling the lever, and let's say you had to pull the lever. What would you do, right? And so when you have the inverse of that, which is there are 10,000 people standing around you with cameras all live publishing your reaction to this particular trolley problem, and they all instantly publish this to the entire world, and everyone will know the decision that you've made. I think at minimum, there's a different set of calculus that you go through, in which case, this is another reason why the naturalistic fallacy is such a great concern, because in both of those cases, if you have different outcomes and you want to argue that what is ought to be, whether or not you're wearing the ring and whether or not the entire world is going to know both your decision and the results of your decision, it's less, I think, about the actual event itself and much more about your own personal results once the decision has been made. And that's certainly in play here. There's several places in the paper where he applies a fair amount of social weight to the argument and saying, surely society would judge you poorly, and other things where he wants to make that claim.
Singer thinks that human nature is a little bit more malleable than we give it credit for. He points to experiments which show that a large influence on how much money people are willing to give to charity is how much they perceive others are giving. We are greatly influenced by the conduct of those around us, and if we feel like we're not doing our fair share in comparison to our peers, this is likely to motivate us to action. Thus, Singer says we should foster a culture of giving, where it is normal to give generously and to be public about this fact, in order to exert social pressure on others to do the same.
Now, before we get too far off the actual argument itself, let's go through the 3 or the 4 premises that he lays out, so that we have these and we can go through these in our counter argument to this. I'm doing this, and I'll note, in the spirit of a moral dilemma. Now, as a kid, we used to do moral dilemmas. There's one life jacket, and there's 3 people in the lifeboat. Who gets the life jacket? Again, the parachute one, the Titanic lifeboat, the trolley problem. Trolley problem is researched and taught at universities all over the world, and we still don't have consensus on it. So the fact that a moral dilemma may not have consensus does not mean that as a species we don't have innate moral principles upon which we act. I'm making the claim, however, that situation and our expected results and a number of other factors highly in how we live our lives and how we've lived our lives up to this point, and social interactions are more at play when we go through these moral dilemmas. And so I am going to give a rebuttal, but first let's get through these 4 premises.
1. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of moral significance, then we must morally do it. That is, prevent that very bad thing from happening. Okay, that's premise 1. I'll just give you a hint. This is going to be the most controversial claim, right? It's a very general claim. It's talking about, very bad things. It's got this big category of very bad things, and then it's got this other category of things with, things that you might sacrifice that are not of moral significance. That's another big category. It's a big, grand claim about what you must do morally, and it's a very general claim. So 1 is going to be the most controversial claim in this argument. So we'll come back to this. Step 2. Hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death are very bad. Okay. Those are some examples of very bad things. We see how this is going to connect up with the first premise, right? We've got a bunch of very bad things. And it's said in the first premise that if it's in your power, or if it's in our power to prevent something very bad, well then we've got to do that thing. We've got to prevent those things. So these are going to be the things that we're going to need to prevent, this argument's going to claim. It's just specifying some very bad things. And premise 2, by the way, seems totally plausible. Hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death are very bad. Yes, that's plausible. Hunger is very bad. Real hunger, where someone doesn't have enough food to eat. And disease, and other things that cause people to suffer or become disabled or die. All of that is bad. Yep, okay, good job. Premise 2, very plausible. Premise 3, the luxuries on which we spend money are not of moral significance. So the kinds of luxuries he's talking about are these luxuries, right? Buying new clothes, when your old clothes, although out of fashion, or a little tattered, or whatever, are perfectly good. Or buying a new car, when your old car, although not as good as a new car, is still a good enough car, right? Or the example that I gave earlier, buying a cup of coffee when you could make the coffee at home. Really, going to any restaurant ever, right, counts as a luxury in this sense. I mean, you can always just, for less money, make food at home. This connects with the idea of moral significance, or of some things not being of moral significance, right? Sacrificing anything of moral significance, that's part of the first premise also. So premise 3 is specifying the kinds of things that aren't of moral significance. And once we understand what Singer means by luxuries, he's right. These things are not of moral significance. They're not a big deal. If you go without them, you're not really worse off. 4, by donating money to relief agencies like Oxfam, we could prevent hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death. Well, that's just saying that there's a very specific way, an easy way, right, to prevent these things which premise 2 established were very bad. Premise 4, is it true? By donating money to relief agencies like Oxfam, we could prevent hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death. Yes, premise 4 is true. This is true. These organizations do this. You can give them the money, and then they will prevent these things. This, premise 4, is just an empirical claim. It's just a claim about whether these organizations actually do the thing that they say they're going to do, and the answer is yes, they do it. Okay, and then here's the conclusion. And we've already reached this conclusion. We've already talked through this conclusion. Therefore, we must. Where is it? Must. We are obligated. It's not supererogatory. It's not extra. This is something you have to do. And so the conclusion gets us something you have to do. We must morally donate the money that we spend on luxuries to relief agencies.
And there we have it, the 4 premises. I will make responses to each and every one of these, but I want to do it in the language that Peter uses himself.
Well, I mean, to give you a kind of classical, almost cliche with a utilitarian dilemma, to elucidate your own view, do you prefer the society of 100 people who all have 100 points of pleasure, or a society of 100,000 people who all have 99 points of pleasure, where the average is slightly lower, but there's far more of them?
I started off by comparing 100 people at a level of 100 with 100,000 people at a level of 99.
Yeah.
And probably most people would be prepared to say, yeah, that small drop in pleasure is worth the fact that there are now so many more people. But as I said, you can just continue with that ad infinitum, and eventually you'll get to a world where you have people at, let's say, 0.001. It has to be positive still for this to work, but it can be life just barely worth living. And yet there's so many people that all of those people at 0.001 adds up to more than the 100,000 at 99.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will say, no, wait a minute, now you've gone too far, right? I'm prepared to have more people if the quality of life is still really good, but now you're getting to some very dull, barely worth living kind of life, and we've lost what I'm not prepared to accept that. And that's the repugnant conclusion to the argument. Now, a lot of philosophers, including Parfit himself, tried hard to work out ways in which you could accept a view that did not have that implication. Parfit never, well, I shouldn't say Parfit never found one, because there was a posthumously published paper in which he put forward some suggestions, which I didn't find totally convincing, I have to say. Some people try to set a floor, sort of a baseline, in other words, and say, well, once life sinks below a certain level, then there's no point in expanding, in having more people living that level. And that level is not the neutral level. It's not the 0.001, but it's 20 or 30 or something on a scale between 0 and 100. Sorry, I should say really on a scale between minus 100 and plus 100. I guess,
sure.
What we're talking about. What do I do about that? Well, as I say, I think it's really hard to grasp these numbers and to think of these differences and to think what this life would be like. So I do find it an uncomfortable conclusion. And on this one, when you say, do I just bite the bullet? I would still like somebody to turn up with a coherent, consistent theory that answers questions about when it's good to bring extra people into existence and when it's bad. And if that theory avoided the repugnant conclusion, that would be a point in its favour.
Yeah.
But there have been a lot of really good philosophers working on this now for 40 or 50 years.
All right, so that was from 2020 from Alex's video, and I think Peter does an amazing job of describing his own personal view. So what are some of the language that we're going to employ here? Everybody has a happiness score, and that score is somewhere between 100 and negative 100. All right, great. I love the premise. I'll accept it. We'll use it in the argument going forward. 2, at 0.001, life is barely worth living. All right, there's a threshold there. And we can label that threshold as the 0.001 threshold. And what do we know about that threshold? It's where it's barely worth living. And then there's another point. He puts it somewhere between 20 and 30, and he suggests that there are many ethicists and philosophers who are suggesting that around 20 or 30, you would not want to bring more people into the group if it lowered overall happiness for everyone below that point. All right, now let's have some fun. Let's go back to the total hedonic happiness or hedonic value utilitarianism. The first thing I'll note is that 1 point of happiness anywhere in the scale is equal to 1 point of happiness anywhere in the scale. There doesn't seem, I haven't seen any definitions, and Peter certainly doesn't make the claim, that a move from 18 to 19 in an individual's hedonic ladder is worth less than a move from 98 to 99. Like when you go to do the calculus and you're adding up the total happiness or the total hedonic metric for a group of 1 million people, if one of them in the last 7 days moved from 18 to 19 in one model, and in a different model, one of the million moved from 98 to 99, because the total of the entire group is the same when you redo the calculus, those two values are of equal value. The second observation I'll make in Peter's own model there is that there is, again, a very important threshold at 0.001 as you go to 0. And I'll say that there's another extremely important threshold as you go from 0 to negative 0.001. And what is the significance there? Well, if well, let's go back to the question of death. If you have 1 million people, and inside this group of 1 million people, you have 1,000 people who are living a life of -1. Now, this isn't going to be a kind or a pleasant argument in any sort of sense, but like, if we're going to do math, let's do some math, and utilitarians want us to do some math, so I'll do some math. So in the group of 1 million people, you have 1,000 who are at -1, and so everybody else is at let's say a 20, right? Because that was the threshold, and then you add up the value of that, and then the very next day you have a plague, and it wipes out the entire group because they didn't have health care, thus they were at -1, of 1,000 people who were living a life of -1. Then the total happiness of the remaining 999,000 is actually greater than the value of the group of 1 million, and because we're only interested in the total value, we say hooray, the total happiness of all the universe has increased, and we take the perspective of the universe and we say today is a happier day than yesterday, and we can mourn their death, but like as long as we're just doing math, we can easily say that the total happiness value is there. Then I'll just make the obvious observation that Peter makes a specific point to say the scale is not 0 to 100, but actually that it's a 100 to -100, and that there are people in existence, and it's possible that they're living lives of pain. And if you look at his other writings, he'll go into his defense of infanticide, the killing of children. Why? Because if they're going to live a life of less than 0, then the total happiness is totally justified. In their own personal happiness at 0 is they're better off than let's say -40. Euthanasia, he comes to the same conclusion. If the rest of your life is going to be a -40, then clearly the overall and your personal happiness is better off if you go to 0 instead of continuing to put time on the clock, at say -50, right? So you can already start to see how this would lead to cracks in the argument. Now let's talk about moral significance. I think that when we go back to the moral significance inside this total hedonic view, we have to say anything which moves the needle for an individual, and thus any subgroup that individual is part of, and thus the entire hedonic value of the entire population as a whole, is of moral significance. Again, if you have 10 people, they're all at 20, you have a total of 200, one of them goes from 20 to 21, that's of moral significance. Why? Because whatever caused that to happen is something that we want to repeat for everyone in the group. Why? Because there's still a lot of potential. There's 800 points of potential in this group that we're currently not experiencing. Then I'll make the very simple argument that if you want to say that there's a threshold at, say, 20, where life is, and I'll just call that the living wage point, right? That you wouldn't want to bring people into a world where they were not at the living wage, because anything below the living wage is a life that's perhaps not as wonderful as the life that they were living. More specifically, I think his argument is anything that pulled the entirety of everyone below 20. If you had 1,000 children and everybody was at 20, but after you had those 1,000 children, if everybody was at 19, including the children, that would not be something that you would want to do, because there is some sort of overall threshold there. But then I'll make the argument, okay, that there's a lot of potential between 20 and 100. What is that potential? What is moving someone who has every need in their life met? Their friendship, their autonomy, their liberty, their food, their housing, their health care, their savings. They have all of that met, right? And yet, in the scale proposed, there's 80 points of potential. Now, I'm going to make the obvious, claim that this is gym memberships and cups of coffee and nice suits and nice clothes and nice cars and nice trips to Paris. All of these 80 points are luxuries. And because we cannot distinguish between a point between 0 and 20 and a point between 20 and 80, that the moral significance of each and every additional layer of luxury that contributes to personal happiness of a person, as decided by them, because happiness is highly subjective, has to be allowed into the calculus. And so there are no sacrifices of luxuries, and especially the type that he's claiming, that you can clearly tell from the language of the paper that he's totally okay asking the individual to go from 100 to 20, where he holds up as an example someone giving away a kidney, which I have to say that probably brings them from 20 to 18 or 17 or something like that, because I don't think we want to live in a world where we're morally obligated to give up body parts in the society that we live in. But he's saying that all of that is moral. Now, why is he making the claim that all of that is moral? He'll also, in refuting the child in the pond versus the child on the other side of the world, make the statement that there should be no difference between those two children in saving their lives. And I'll make the argument that there's a world of difference, and let's look into what that difference is. Now, the paper is absolutely clear that if you're living in a first world country, that your life is most likely filled with luxuries. That you're probably not living a life of 20, if you're on the low end of society and you're middle class, you're probably at 30, 40, 50, and there's a number of people in upper middle class that have a ton of luxuries that puts them in 50 to 80, and we even have a few super hedonists that are able to live a life of much higher than 80, because the scale goes all the way to 100, and it's defined by hedonic values. And yes, I'm making the claim that you can get there through money. You can also get there through other ways, where you're living. If you go to the beach every day, it may not cost you more than a bus ticket, but the hedonic value of that to you may be enormous, especially if you love surfing. And so, but in these first world countries, in the paper itself, he says the vast majority of people in these communities are living a life of luxury. All right, so now let's look at the counter argument. A premise that we've almost completely accepted, but hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability are very bad. So I will accept the premise that each of these are the source of anyone who is below 0. If we're to postulate that there are people, we can go into Eastern religion, all of life is suffering. I'll say suffering is not equally distributed, and that there are some people who are living highly, lives which are well into -5, okay, -10, -20, -40, and that these people exist in the world. I think we have to accept that premise. Why would you have the scale go all the way down to negative 100 if there was not, in the case of history, people living at that level? And if we say, how would we come up with a classification system to kind of do a coin bank where we put people above 80 and 80 to 20 and then 0 to 20 and then negative 5 to 0 and perhaps negative 40 to negative 5 and then negative 100 to negative 40. I think we would look for the presence of these very things: hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and we would say that's how they got to that negative point. Now, I've taken issue with death, and let's define death as the event that moves someone from wherever they are on the scale of negative 100 to positive 100 to a state of 0. Now, traditional death, which is the death that each of us see in our communities around us. Again, this paper is written specifically for those who enjoy great luxuries, and so if the audience is those enjoying luxuries, then, and in communities that have a high degree of luxury, then we would say in those places death is commonly defined as moving from a positive number to a 0 number. And if we're just going to add up the hedonic points at the end of the day, if last week, there was 1 million of us and then 1,000 of us died, and each of them were between, let's say, 30 and 80, all of them were between 30 and 80, then we know that the loss from those deaths is no less than 30 times 1,000, 30,000, and could be potentially as high as 80, because they go from 80 to 0, 80,000. Now, he wants to make the claim in the paper and post the paper that there is no difference between someone who lives in your community and someone on the other side of the world who is suffering hunger, disease, other sources of suffering, disability, and he wants to say that we should treat the death of someone who's potentially at, let's say, negative 30, and death, again, is defined as negative 30 to 0. And he then says, why aren't you treating the death of someone at negative 30 the same way that you would treat somebody who you believe is at 50? Right? When we save the child in the pond, we have this movie going in our head. Oh my gosh, they haven't been to high school. Imagine all the wonderful things they're going to do in high school. They haven't been to college. All the things they're going to do in college. They haven't become a world-renowned philosopher. Imagine all the lives they change. And so there's a ton of potential in that life, right? Inversely, I think he fails to make the claim and substantiate the claim that when someone is hungry, diseased, and going through other forms of suffering and disability, that they're not currently at a state below 0. Now, again, he openly states that morality can be repugnant. And I'm going to say that cold hard math like this is obviously repugnant. But it's not my system. This is actually his system. I'm walking you through the calculus that he's asking us to adopt, not just in this paper, but in life in totality. We should all look at the world this way, right? This is how he's going to get into animal ethics, and how he's going to get into euthanasia, and how he's going to get into alleviating the suffering of children. And in other papers, he actually makes these exact arguments, that when you go from negative 30 to 0, that someone doing the calculus for the entirety of the universe is going to say the world is a better place. I said, well, if you're going to make that argument over there, why not make it over here? Now, I've already addressed number 3. Luxuries on which we spend money are not of moral significance. I think in the case that we're playing the the playground moral dilemma, if your luxury is at one end of the trolley problem and a child of young potentials at the other, and anything that doesn't beat the child is not of moral significance, I'm happy saying that yes, the child wins each and every time in that case. But that's not the game that we're playing, is it? That's a subset, a small slice of the real game that he asks us to play, which is hedonic calculus, where, again, we're looking at the value of luxuries, and I'm suggesting, postulating from his own words, that luxuries are the only thing that takes us from 20 to 100. And that once you deny all of the luxuries in your life, that your potential goes from a potential of 100 to a potential of, let's say, 20. Right? That's where we said, life is okay, you're not unhappy, but you've denied yourself all of the luxuries, and so we're going to say you're at 20. How is 20 to 100 in the moral calculus, which is 80% of the potential of 0 to 100, how is that not of moral significance in this calculus? So I think that point's well made. And then the final point, that by donating money to relief agencies, again, I haven't argued with this point, but I will argue that in the case that that donation decreases your own personal happiness, that you actually prefer the cup of coffee every day before you go into work, or you prefer the gym membership, or you prefer the suit, the coat of many colors. If you prefer a library in your home when it's absolutely a luxury, filled with books that cost thousands and thousands of dollars, that if your own personal happiness is higher in that case, and you have no evidence that you would be alleviating someone of similar potential to you, and the paper outright states that if you're saving someone in your own community, you're most likely saving someone who is realizing the potential of those luxuries. But if you're saving someone outside of your own community, and especially the focus of these agencies, that you're most likely preventing someone going from -30 to 0. So can you use your money to prevent the incident of someone going from -30 to 0? Absolutely. Give them some food. Let them live with all the other suffering that they are already going under. And there you go. Now, when we do the calculus at the end of the week, your own happiness has decreased by the amount of any of the luxuries that you've denied yourself, and the suffering that was most likely present in the communities that these agencies focus on continues, and was not decreased by the natural death that was prevented by your donation. Again, not my arguments, not the way I choose to live my life, but this is absolutely I hope, a valid moral argument that counters the conclusions at the end of this paper. What are the conclusions? Well, A, if you can make a donation without moral significance, to which I say you can't. Luxuries are all we have to take us from 20 to 100, and once we start denying ourselves of that, we deny ourselves of the potential. And those in our own communities where those luxuries are prevalent, the potential of going from 20 to 100, and any drop there has equal value in the hedonic calculus as any increase that you may have caused on the other side. And then on the other side, because the entire range is -100 to 100, it's more likely than not that you're helping someone who doesn't have basic needs. So they're not at 20, they're most likely at 0 or below. And you can just, what's the average of -120? And we say, okay, that's what's that, negative 40. And in all likelihood, they're at negative 40. And what are you alleviating? You're alleviating the event of going from negative 40 to 0. And does alleviating an event of negative 40 to 0 increase the total happiness at the end of that decision? The easy answer is obviously no. Now, going back to all of the statements that Peter wants to make, it doesn't matter if you like the argument or not. You just go through the argument and see if it's valid. And imagine Oxfam if they only helped out people who were 20 or above. Like, I think it loses, like, all power. Now, can we call people who are working on moving themselves and their communities and their neighbors and everyone that they know from 20 to someplace higher than 20 immoral? And I'm saying as long as the effects of that effort is positive, you have to say that the action itself is also morally positive, right? And how about the prevention of events where the natural tendency is from negative 40 to 0? If you prevent those, is that a good thing? Hard for me to use this calculus to come up to that. Maybe somebody else can show me how that math works. But I think it's very easy once you use his own system to come up with a counter argument and start to show where many of the premises that he makes, that when you save a child of high potential that's living in a community where the enjoyment of luxuries is highly likely, is not equivalent to saving a random person on the other side of the world where the existence of people living lives in the negative 100 to 100 range is common. Why anybody would equivocate those two events, I have no idea. And so there you go. Very simple counter argument. Not a core part of patchwork legalism. Patchwork legalism is again going to take the stance that you should live your life first by finding a community that you want to be part of, and if that community is rich in luxuries or poor in luxuries, I don't care. Go find it. And once you're in that community, being a full participant in that community, and once there are needs that you identify that are unmet by the community, that you seek as best you can to increase the power of those secondary ancillary communities, again in an effort of maximizing the hedonic value that we all enjoy, and if giving to a charity gives you pleasure, why not? If you love telling your friends how much you give and telling yourself stories of how many people you saved, and you would rather do that than buy a Netflix subscription or a gym subscription, please act in accordance to your own morality. But again, I'm rejecting the claim that someone outside of your community can just create rules, start calling you names, and that you should act as a result of that. Because then it's just whoever can call you the worst name, right? That's what your morality becomes. And how well can they convince you that you really deserve those derogatory terms? Now, Peter Singer, I love as a philosopher. He's not afraid to put down what he actually believes on paper, on video. I love the fact that he's an extreme pragmatist. I highly encourage you to look through all three of those videos and many others that are available on YouTube. I love the fact that he's willing to have conversations for 50 years on topics of moral significance, and that he's willing and able to share his current view of the world with anybody and everybody that will listen, and that he's unafraid of hard choices or hard decisions. So much to be loved in his approach to life. And, well, there you go. That's my rebuttal to the challenge I received from the 2 videos that asked me to take a crack at making a counter-argument to the 1972 paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality.